Before we begin, if you enjoy this deep dive into Cold War espionage history, please like and subscribe for more untold stories from the intelligence world. Your support helps us bring these remarkable true stories to light. On the evening of March 17, 1984, at approximately 9:43 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a 52-year-old amateur radio enthusiast named Gordon Fletcher sat in the converted basement of his split-level home in Fairfax, Virginia, adjusting the frequency dial on his Kenwood TS-830S transceiver. The weather that night was clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s. Fletcher, a retired electrical engineer who had worked for RCA for 27 years before taking early retirement in 1982, spent most evenings in his basement radio room listening to shortwave broadcasts from around the world. His hobby was what radio operators call dishing, seeking distant signals, logging stations from different countries, collecting QSL cards that confirmed reception of broadcasts from remote locations. Fletcher's basement setup was extensive. He had 3 separate receivers, multiple antennas mounted on his roof and in his backyard, a wall covered with QSL cards from over 80 countries, and a meticulous logbook in which he recorded every significant reception. His wife, Carol, tolerated the hobby with bemused patience, occasionally bringing him coffee or reminding him to come upstairs before midnight. Their 2 adult children had long since moved to other states. At 9:43 p.m., Fletcher's receiver was tuned to 11.370 megahertz, a frequency hosting what shortwave enthusiasts and intelligence agencies called a numbers station, mysterious broadcasts consisting of synthesized voices reading sequences of numbers in various languages. These stations had been documented since at least the 1950s, their purpose officially unacknowledged by any government, but widely understood to be encrypted communications for intelligence agents operating in foreign countries. Fletcher had been logging numbers stations since the mid-1970s. He maintained a separate section of his logbook dedicated to these broadcasts, noting their frequencies, schedules, and identifying characteristics. His interest was purely technical. He was fascinated by signal propagation and broadcast techniques. He had no illusions about decrypting the messages. The number sequences were obviously encoded using unbreakable cipher systems. He heard the station's identifying signal, 5 ascending tones he had documented in previous logs. Then a synthesized female voice began reading numbers in English. 14873, 9-2-6-1-5, 3-8-0-4-2. Fletcher noted the time, frequency, and signal strength in his logbook, as he had done dozens of times before with this particular station. But approximately 90 seconds into the broadcast, the synthesized voice abruptly stopped mid-sequence. Silence for 5 seconds. Then background noise. Indistinct sounds suggesting an open microphone in a room, possibly voices speaking at a distance, though too faint to make out words clearly. This continued for approximately 23 seconds. Fletcher grabbed a cassette recorder and pressed record, capturing the last several seconds of background noise before the transmission abruptly cut off entirely. He rewound the tape and listened again. The background sounds were faint, but definitely present. What sounded like at least 2 people speaking, possibly 3, and what might have been a chair scraping or a door closing. In nearly a decade of monitoring numbers stations, he had never encountered such a technical malfunction. He noted the incident in his logbook with particular detail. March 17, 1984, 2143 Eastern Standard Time, 11.370 megahertz. Regular Saturday station. Transmission interrupted at approximately 90 seconds. Open microphone, approximately 23 seconds. Background sounds recorded on tape. Station went silent. What Gordon Fletcher did not know was that the malfunction had occurred at a KGB transmission facility operated by Directorate S, responsible for illegals, Soviet intelligence officers operating under deep cover in the United States with false identities, no diplomatic protection, and no official connection to Soviet institutions. The facility was located in a rural area approximately 40 miles north of Mexico City. The malfunction had been caused by a relay switch failure in the automated transmission system. For 23 seconds, the microphone in the control room had remained open, transmitting ambient sound before technicians recognized the problem and terminated the transmission. Soviet communications officials assumed the malfunction posed minimal security risk. The background sounds had been too faint and indistinct to reveal anything significant. This assessment was correct as far as it went, but what they did not know was that the malfunction had been noticed and recorded by an amateur radio operator in Virginia, and that this recording would eventually lead to one of the most significant FBI counterintelligence operations of the mid-1980s. 3 days later, on March 20th, 1984, Gordon Fletcher was at his local public library in Fairfax, returning several books on antenna design. He encountered a man he knew casually from the Northern Virginia Radio Club named Raymond Ellis, 48 years old. An engineer at a telecommunications company. They had spoken at several club meetings about technical topics. Ellis asked Fletcher if he had logged anything interesting recently. Fletcher mentioned the number station malfunction, describing it as an unusual technical anomaly. He offered to play Ellis the recording if he was interested. Ellis expressed enthusiasm, and the two men agreed to meet at Fletcher's house the following Saturday. What Fletcher did not know was that Raymond Ellis was, in addition to being a telecommunications engineer, an amateur radio enthusiast, an analyst with the National Security Agency's Office of Signals Intelligence. His involvement in the Northern Virginia Radio Club was both a genuine hobby and a useful source of information. Amateur radio operators sometimes noticed things relevant to signals intelligence work, and Ellis had standing instructions to report anything potentially significant. On Saturday, March 24, 1984, Ellis visited Fletcher's home. In the basement radio room, Fletcher played him the recording of the March 17th transmission. Ellis listened carefully, asking Fletcher to replay it several times. He made notes about the frequency, the time, and the characteristics of the malfunction. He thanked Fletcher and left after about 45 minutes. On Monday, March 26, 1984, Ellis was at his NSA office at Fort Meade. He wrote a brief memorandum describing the incident and submitted it through normal channels. The memorandum reached signals intelligence analyst Lauren Huang, 36 years old, who had been working at NSA for 8 years, specializing in Soviet clandestine communications, including numbers stations. Huang read Ellis's memorandum with interest. She retrieved signal intelligence logs for 11.370 megahertz and began reviewing NSA's records of the numbers station that broadcast on that frequency. NSA had been monitoring that particular station for approximately 7 years, designating it with the code name Redwood. The station broadcast on Saturday evenings at irregular intervals, always between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Huang analyzed the dates and intervals between Redwood's 127 documented transmissions over 7 years. While the broadcasts appeared irregular at first glance, they actually followed a subtle pattern. The station broadcast most frequently during certain months: March, June, September, and December, and within those months, broadcasts clustered around the middle and end of each month. This pattern suggested Redwood was communicating with illegals who had regular reporting schedules tied to specific intelligence collection requirements. The variation in frequency suggested multiple agents receiving instructions through the same station. Huang prepared a detailed analysis and submitted it to her supervisor with a recommendation that Redwood be given higher priority for monitoring. Meanwhile, approximately 90 miles northeast of Gordon Fletcher's home, in a modest two-story colonial house in Bethesda, Maryland, a man named David Brennan was experiencing increasing anxiety. Brennan was 44 years old. He lived in the house with his wife, Susan, 42, and their two children, a daughter named Rachel, age 14, and a son named Eric, age 11. Brennan worked as an accountant at a medium-sized firm in downtown Washington, D.C., specializing in tax preparation. Susan worked part-time as a dental hygienist. They had lived in the neighborhood since 1976. To their neighbors, the Brennans were entirely ordinary. David was pleasant but reserved, the kind of neighbor who would wave hello but rarely initiated conversations. Susan was more social, involved in the local PTA, known for baking cookies for school fundraisers. Rachel was a good student, quiet and studious. Eric played Little League baseball and collected comic books. The family attended a Methodist church on Sundays. They had a golden retriever named Max. Their home was well maintained, their lawn neatly mowed. But David and Susan Brennan were not who they appeared to be. Their real names were Dmitri Mikhailovich Volkov and Svetlana Vasilyevna Volkova. They were KGB illegals who had been operating in the United States since 1972, trained extensively in Soviet intelligence schools, provided with meticulously constructed false identities, and inserted into American society with instructions to establish themselves as normal Americans and conduct intelligence operations when called upon. Their legend was comprehensive. According to their documentation, David Brennan had been born in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1940. His parents, supposedly deceased, had been working-class Americans. He had attended public schools, served briefly in the Army in the early 1960s, attended community college, and worked various jobs before entering the accounting profession. Susan's legend placed her birth in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1942, the daughter of a steelworker and a homemaker, both also supposedly deceased. They had supposedly met in Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s, married in 1969, and started their family. The reality was that Dmitri Volkov had been born in Leningrad in 1940, the son of a Communist Party official. He had been recruited into KGB service in his early 20s after completing a degree in economics at Leningrad State University. He had spent 4 years in intensive training, learning to speak English with a convincing American accent, studying American culture, memorizing the details of his legend. Svetlana Volkova had been born in Moscow in 1942, the daughter of a military officer. She had studied mathematics at Moscow State University and had been recruited into KGB service in 1964. The two had met during training and had been paired by KGB planners who believed they would function well as a married couple in deep cover. They had entered the United States separately in 1972, he through Canada and she through Mexico, using false identities and meticulously prepared documentation. They had married in 1973. Their daughter Rachel had been born to them in 1970, before their insertion into the United States, and had been kept in the Soviet Union until they were ready to construct the family unit. She had been brought to the United States in 1973, reunited with her biological parents, and had grown up believing the legend. Eric, born in 1973, was genuinely their biological child. conceived and born after their insertion into the United States. He was a U.S. citizen by birth. Neither child knew their parents were Soviet intelligence officers. For 12 years, from 1972 to 1984, the Volkovs had lived their cover. David worked as an accountant, maintaining real employment and paying taxes. Susan worked as a dental hygienist. They paid their mortgage, attended parent-teacher conferences, celebrated American holidays. And periodically, they conducted intelligence operations. Their primary function was not active espionage in the traditional sense. They did not have access to classified information through their employment. Instead, they served as support infrastructure for other Soviet intelligence operations. They provided secure communication channels, served as couriers, provided safe houses for meetings, helped with logistics. Most importantly, they received instructions through one-way encrypted communications from Moscow Center via shortwave radio transmissions from numbers stations. The station they monitored was Redwood, broadcasting on 11.370 MHz on Saturday evenings. David had a shortwave receiver hidden in the attic of their house, behind insulation and boxes. On Saturday evenings, when expecting a transmission, David would tell his family he needed to work on household repairs, climb into the attic, and tune to the appropriate frequency. He would write down the number sequences, then use a one-time pad, a booklet of random numbers used for unbreakable encryption, to decrypt the message. The one-time pad was hidden in a waterproof container buried in the backyard under the roots of a large oak tree. On March 17, 1984, David Volkov had been in the attic at 9:43 p.m., listening to the Redwood transmission. He had begun writing down the number sequences when the transmission had suddenly gone silent, then resumed with strange background sounds. The transmission ended abruptly, and he was left with an incomplete message. For 3 days he waited, uncertain what to do. Incomplete messages were a serious problem. Without the complete number sequence, he could not decrypt the message accurately. He had no way to request a retransmission. Communication was one way only. On March 20, 1984, Redwood broadcast again on a non-scheduled date, itself unusual. David was in the attic, listening. When he decrypted it, the message indicated that the previous transmission had been compromised due to technical problems and should be disregarded. The new message contained routine instructions about a scheduled meeting in April. David was relieved, but remained uneasy. Technical problems with transmissions were rare. However, his training emphasized maintaining discipline and following procedures. He filed the incident in his memory as an anomaly and continued his normal routine. What David Volkov did not know was that Lauren Huang had been given authorization to intensify monitoring of Redwood, and that the unexpected March 20th transmission had been logged by NSA. Huang noted it was the first time in 7 years that Redwood had broadcast on a non-scheduled date. She hypothesized the March 20th transmission might be connected to the March 17th malfunction, possibly a retransmission or an alert signal. Huang prepared a detailed briefing about Redwood and presented it at an Intelligence Community Working Group meeting on April 3, 1984. The meeting was attended by representatives from NSA, FBI, and CIA. Huang outlined the pattern of REDWOOD's transmissions, the March 17th malfunction, and the unusual March 20th transmission. She emphasized that while NSA could monitor the transmissions, they could not decrypt them without the one-time pads used by the recipients. However, she suggested that transmission patterns might be analyzed to identify potential recipients within the United States. FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, 41 years old, who specialized in Soviet counterintelligence, was present at the meeting. Webb had been with the FBI for 16 years and had worked extensively on cases involving Soviet illegals. After Huang's presentation, Webb requested copies of all available data on Redwood transmissions for the previous 2 years. Over the following 6 weeks, between April and mid-May 1984, Webb worked with a team of analysts to examine Redwood's transmission patterns. They noted several significant details. The frequency of transmissions increased during months, corresponding with high-priority Soviet intelligence collection periods. Certain number sequences appeared repeatedly across multiple transmissions in different positions, suggesting recurring instructions or identifiers rather than unique one-time content. When they cross-referenced Redwood transmission dates with FBI surveillance logs from Soviet diplomatic facilities, they found no correlation, strongly suggesting Redwood was not communicating with Soviet diplomats, but with illegals. Webb prepared a recommendation that FBI initiate a systematic effort to identify potential Soviet illegals who might be receiving Redwood transmissions. The operation was given the code name Distant Signal and was approved by FBI leadership in June 1984. One early lead came from routine review of background verification files. FBI analysts began looking for Americans whose background stories showed certain characteristics: deaths of parents that could not be easily verified, gaps in employment or educational history, minimal footprint in public records during formative years, or Social Security numbers issued in ways inconsistent with claimed biographical details. In August 1984, FBI analyst James Kowalski, 29 years old, was reviewing tax records for residents of Montgomery County, Maryland. He noticed that an accountant named David Brennan had filed his first federal tax return in 1972 at age 32. This was unusual. Most Americans file their first tax return as teenagers or young adults. Kowalski pulled Brennan's complete file. His Social Security number had been issued in Ohio in 1960. He had no tax returns on file before 1972. His military service record showed he had enlisted in the Army in 1961 and had been discharged in 1963. There was no record of employment between 1963 and 1972, a 9-year gap. Kowalski flagged this as potentially suspicious. On August 24, 1984, FBI agents began discreet background checks. They contacted the Army to verify his service record. The Army records showed that a David James Brennan had indeed served from 1961 to 1963, but when agents compared the physical description from Army records, height, weight, eye color, with current photographs obtained through surveillance, there were discrepancies. The Army's David Brennan had been 5 feet 11 inches tall with blue eyes. The current David Brennan appeared to be approximately 6 feet tall with brown eyes. This warranted increased scrutiny. FBI agents in the Washington field office began surveillance of David Brennan on September 6, 1984. They documented his daily routine: departure for work around 7:45 a.m., arrival at his accounting firm's office, lunch routines, return home typically around 6:15 p.m. But on Saturday evening, September 15, 1984, surveillance agents noticed something unusual. At approximately 9:20 p.m., David Brennan climbed into his attic and remained there for approximately 35 minutes. This timing was significant because September 15th was a date when Redwood was scheduled to broadcast. The FBI immediately coordinated with NSA. NSA confirmed that Redwood did broadcast on September 15th, beginning at 9:35 p.m. and concluding at 9:42 p.m. The timing coincided precisely with David Brennan's presence in his attic. This was highly suggestive. The FBI expanded surveillance to include his wife, Susan. Background checks on Susan Brennan revealed similar anomalies. Her Social Security number had been issued in Pennsylvania in 1962, but there were no tax records for her before 1973, when she was 31 years old. Birth certificates for both David and Susan were on file with local authorities, but when FBI agents checked with hospitals where they had supposedly been born, there were no medical records to confirm the births. The FBI faced a significant challenge. Proving espionage would require evidence of specific intelligence activities. Merely listening to shortwave radio broadcasts was not illegal. The FBI needed to catch them in an actual intelligence operation. FBI technical surveillance teams obtained authorization for electronic monitoring. On October 3, 1984, while the family was away at a school event, FBI agents entered the house and installed surveillance devices, microphones in key rooms, and a recording device connected to the telephone line. The audio surveillance provided insight into daily life. Most of what was recorded was entirely mundane: family conversations about schoolwork, household chores, television programs. David and Susan were careful never to discuss anything related to intelligence operations when their children were present. However, on October 12, 1984, the surveillance captured a significant conversation. It was approximately 11:20 p.m., and both children were asleep. David and Susan were in their bedroom. FBI agents listening heard David say, in English, but with subtle phrasing suggesting it was not his native language, "The schedule has changed." "We have a meeting on the 24th instead of the 28th, Susan responded. "Where?" David. "The usual location." Susan. "Do we know what the requirement is?" David. "Documents from the target we discussed. The contact will have them." FBI agents immediately began planning enhanced surveillance for October 24th. They reviewed previous surveillance logs, identifying several locations where the Brennans had been observed: a shopping mall in Tyson's Corner, a park near the Potomac River, a public library in Silver Spring. On October 24th, 1984, FBI agents positioned surveillance teams at all these locations. October 24th was a Wednesday. David Brennan left for work at his usual time. At 12:15 p.m., he left the office and drove north on Connecticut Avenue, eventually parking near the National Zoo. He entered the zoo. FBI agents followed him on foot. Brennan walked through the zoo for approximately 20 minutes, stopping occasionally as if to observe animals, though agents noted he seemed more interested in checking his surroundings. At 12:50 p.m., he sat on a bench near the elephant enclosure and opened a newspaper. At 12:58 p.m., a man approached. FBI agents would later identify this man as Yuri Petrov, 38 years old, listed as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, but believed by FBI counterintelligence to be a KGB officer. Petrov sat on the same bench, leaving approximately 3 feet between himself and Brennan. Both men appeared to be reading their respective newspapers and did not acknowledge each other. After approximately 4 minutes, Brennan stood, folded his newspaper, and walked away, leaving the newspaper on the bench. He continued walking through the zoo and eventually exited. Surveillance agents maintained coverage of both men. Approximately 6 minutes after Brennan had departed, Petrov stood, picked up the newspaper Brennan had left, and walked away. He exited the zoo and drove toward the Soviet embassy. FBI agents photographed the entire sequence. They now had documentation of what appeared to be a brush pass, the exchange of a newspaper that likely contained hidden documents or instructions. FBI leadership decided to continue surveillance while preparing for eventual arrest. Over the next 6 weeks, between late October and early December 1984, FBI surveillance documented 2 additional meetings between David Brennan and Soviet diplomats. One occurred at a public library, where Brennan and another Soviet diplomat exchanged packages of books. The second occurred at a metro station, where Brennan left a magazine in a telephone booth that was later retrieved by a Soviet intelligence officer. Meanwhile, FBI investigators coordinated with intelligence services in Allied countries. In November 1984, a source with knowledge of KGB illegal operations reviewed information about the Brennans and confirmed the profile matched known characteristics of Soviet illegals inserted into the United States in the early 1970s. On December 7, 1984, NSA provided additional information. Signals intelligence analysts had correlated Redwood transmissions with observed Brennan activities. They identified a pattern. Redwood transmissions on specific dates, consistently preceded by 1 to 3 weeks meetings or activities by David Brennan that appeared to be intelligence-related. The FBI decided to move forward with arrests. On the morning of December 18, 1984, at approximately 6:55 a.m., 3 FBI vehicles pulled up to the Brennan residence. Rachel had already left for an early morning band practice. Eric was still at home, eating breakfast. David was upstairs getting dressed for work. Susan was in the kitchen with Eric. FBI agents knocked on the door and announced their presence. Susan Brennan opened the door. Lead FBI agent Marcus Webb presented her with an arrest warrant. Susan's face showed momentary shock before becoming carefully neutral. She asked if she could get her coat. Webb accompanied her as she retrieved a jacket. David Brennan, hearing the commotion, came downstairs and was immediately confronted by FBI agents and informed he was under arrest for espionage. Eric Brennan, 11 years old, witnessed his parents being placed in handcuffs. He began crying and asking what was happening. One FBI agent, a woman named Catherine Reynolds, who had been specifically assigned to help manage the children's welfare, knelt down and told Eric as gently as possible that his parents needed to go with the FBI to answer some questions and that arrangements would be made to ensure he was taken care of. Eric's response was to ask repeatedly, "What did they do? Why are you taking them?" Eric was taken temporarily into the custody of Child Protective Services. The FBI soon discovered that the Brennans' relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents supposedly living in Ohio and Pennsylvania, did not exist. The addresses and phone numbers led to non-existent people or individuals who had never heard of the Brennans. Rachel Brennan was informed of her parents' arrest when FBI agents came to her school at approximately 8:30 a.m. She was 14 years old, a freshman in high school. According to school officials who were present, Rachel's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger, followed by tears. She insisted there must be a mistake. She demanded to see her parents. She refused to believe they had been arrested for espionage. Both children were placed temporarily with a foster family. The situation was unprecedented. Eric was a U.S. citizen by birth. He had been born in the United States. Rachel's status was more complicated. She had been born in the Soviet Union but had been in the United States since she was approximately 3 years old and had been raised believing she was American. Eventually, the decision was made to keep both children in the United States. Rachel would remain in foster care until she reached legal adulthood. Eric would be placed with a foster family with the possibility of adoption. The Brennan house was searched extensively. FBI agents found the shortwave receiver in the attic, concealed behind insulation. They found the one-time pad buried in the backyard. They found in David's home office a camera designed for photographing documents. several rolls of unexposed microfilm, and $14,600 in cash hidden in a false bottom in a desk drawer. They found false passports in different names. They found notes in David's handwriting containing information about U.S. defense contractors and military installations. David and Susan Brennan were held in separate FBI facilities and interrogated separately. Both initially refused to answer questions and requested attorneys. However, after several days, during which they were informed of the extensive evidence against them and the fact that their children were in state custody, Susan Brennan broke. According to FBI interrogation transcripts, Susan requested to speak to interrogators without her attorney present on December 22, 1984. She told them she was willing to cooperate if the FBI would agree to certain conditions. Her primary concern was for her children. She wanted assurances that Rachel and Eric would be cared for and would not be prosecuted or deported. She wanted to be able to see them and explain the situation. FBI and Justice Department officials considered her requests. Securing cooperation from one or both of the Brennans would provide valuable intelligence about Soviet illegal operations. On December 28, 1984, an agreement was reached. Susan Brennan would plead guilty to espionage charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 15 years rather than life imprisonment. She would cooperate fully with FBI debriefings. In exchange, the government would not pursue prosecution of Rachel and would guarantee that Eric, as a U.S. citizen, would not be deported. The government would also allow Susan limited, supervised contact with her children before her imprisonment. David Brennan, informed of his wife's cooperation, eventually agreed to a similar deal, a recommended 20-year sentence in exchange for more extensive cooperation about Soviet intelligence operations. The debriefings of David and Susan Brennan, conducted between January and May 1985, provided significant intelligence about Soviet illegal operations. They revealed details about their training in the Soviet Union, the process by which they had been given false identities, the methods they used to maintain cover, communication protocols, and the specific intelligence operations they had conducted during their 12 years in the United States. According to their debriefings, the Brennans had facilitated operations for at least 7 other Soviet agents operating in the United States. They had served as couriers for documents stolen from defense contractors and government agencies. They had helped coordinate meetings between Soviet intelligence officers and American assets. They had provided safe houses. They had helped launder money used to pay other agents. The damage assessment concluded that the Brennans' operations had contributed to the compromise of several classified U.S. defense programs. The legal proceedings moved forward. David and Susan Brennan were arraigned in federal district court in March 1985. Both pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit espionage and acting as agents of a foreign government. At the sentencing hearing on April 25, 1985, federal prosecutors presented detailed evidence of the Brennans' espionage activities. Defense attorneys emphasized their cooperation, their expressed remorse, and the impact long sentences would have on their children. The judge, Margaret Patterson, 58 years old, acknowledged the complexity of the case but emphasized the seriousness of espionage and betrayal of trust. Judge Patterson sentenced David Brennan to 25 years in federal prison, 5 years more than the prosecution had recommended. Susan Brennan was sentenced to 18 years, 3 years more than recommended. Both would be eligible for parole after serving 2/3 of their sentences, assuming good behavior. David was sent to the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Susan was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia. For Rachel and Eric Brennan, The arrest and imprisonment of their parents represented a catastrophic rupture in their understanding of reality. Everything they had believed about their family, their identity, and their place in the world had been revealed as a lie. Their parents were not American. Their family history was fabricated. Their names were not even real. In the weeks following the arrest, both children struggled with depression, confusion, and anger. They were placed with a foster family in Virginia, far from their Bethesda neighborhood, to protect their privacy. Social workers and psychologists worked with them to help them process the trauma. Rachel's response was anger. According to psychologists who worked with her, Rachel felt betrayed by her parents. She felt that her entire childhood had been a performance, that her parents' love had been conditional and false, that she had been used as cover for criminal activities. She refused to visit her mother in prison when offered the opportunity in May 1985. She told social workers she wanted nothing to do with her parents and wanted to change her name to distance herself from them. Eric's response was different. He was younger and less able to process the complexity. He told psychologists that he loved his parents and wanted to see them. He couldn't understand why what they had done was wrong. He was confused about why the government was keeping them in prison. He held on to the belief that there must be some misunderstanding that would eventually be resolved. In June 1985, Rachel, now 15 years old, made the decision to visit her mother in prison. According to social workers who accompanied her, the visit was difficult. Rachel sat across from her mother in the prison visiting room and asked a series of questions. "Were you ever really my mother, or was that just part of your cover? Did you ever actually love me, or was I just part of your disguise? Did anything about our family ever mean anything to you?" Susan Brennan broke down in tears. She told Rachel that she was her biological mother, that Rachel had been born in the Soviet Union, that she had been brought to the United States as part of the mission, but that none of that changed the fact that Susan loved her. She tried to explain that she and David had believed they were serving their country, that they hadn't understood until too late the cost their service would exact from their children. Rachel's response was, "You chose them over us. You chose your country over your children." She left the prison and refused further contact with her mother for several years. Eric visited his parents separately, his mother in June 1985 and his father in July 1985. His visits were less confrontational, but no less painful. Eric asked his father why he had lied, why he had pretended to be someone he wasn't. David tried to explain in terms an 11-year-old might understand that sometimes adults make choices that seem right at the time, but turn out to cause harm they didn't intend. Eric asked if his father was sorry. David said yes, though Eric later told his foster parents that he wasn't sure if his father was sorry for what he'd done or sorry that he'd been caught. The broader implications of the Brennan case extended beyond the immediate family. The FBI's distant signal operation continued, using intelligence gained from the Brennans' debriefings to identify other potential illegals. Between 1985 and 1987, the FBI identified and arrested 4 other Soviet illegal couples operating in different parts of the United States. The revelation that Soviet illegals had been operating successfully in American suburbs for over a decade, raising children and participating in community life while conducting espionage, had a significant psychological impact on American counterintelligence. For the Soviet intelligence services, the exposure of the Brennans and subsequent illegals represented a significant operational failure. The numbers station system, considered secure, was now known to be monitored and potentially compromised. The Brennan case led to a comprehensive review of illegal operations and communication protocols. Some illegals were recalled to the Soviet Union. Others were instructed to cease intelligence activities and maintain their cover indefinitely. The Redwood numbers station continued broadcasting sporadically through 1985 and 1986, but its transmissions became less frequent and eventually ceased entirely sometime in 1987. For Gordon Fletcher, the amateur radio operator whose recording of the malfunction had initiated the investigation, the outcome was both gratifying and troubling. FBI officials contacted him in February 1985 and informed him that his report had contributed to a significant counterintelligence success. Fletcher was invited to FBI headquarters and was given a commendation. He was asked to continue monitoring shortwave frequencies and reporting anomalies. In interviews Fletcher gave years later, he reflected on the strange feeling of knowing that his hobby had inadvertently led to the destruction of a family. He emphasized that he bore no responsibility for the Brennans' choices. They had chosen to engage in espionage, and the consequences were theirs to bear. But he acknowledged feeling unsettled by the knowledge that his casual mention of a technical anomaly had set in motion events that ended with 2 people in prison and 2 children traumatized. Raymond Ellis, the NSA analyst who had passed Fletcher's information to intelligence authorities, continued his work at NSA and maintained his membership in the Northern Virginia Radio Club. Lauren Huang, whose work on Redwood transmission patterns had been crucial, was promoted and eventually became a senior analyst specializing in clandestine communications. Marcus Webb, the FBI special agent who had led the investigation, received commendations and was eventually promoted to supervisory special agent. For David Brennan, or Dmitri Volkov, imprisonment was a period of profound reflection. According to prison records, David was a model prisoner who caused no trouble and spent much of his time reading. In 1991, when David had been in prison for 6 years, he received a letter from Eric, who was then 18 years old and about to graduate from high school. Eric wrote that he had spent years angry at his father, but had recently been working with a therapist to understand his feelings. He wrote that he didn't condone what his father had done, but wanted to understand why. He asked if his father would be willing to answer questions honestly. David responded with a long letter in which he attempted to explain his motivations. He wrote about growing up in the Soviet Union, about believing in the communist system, about being recruited into intelligence service and feeling honored to serve his country. He wrote about years of training, the construction of his false identity, the insertion into American life. He tried to explain how he had rationalized his espionage activities as serving the cause of preventing war. And he acknowledged that these rationalizations had been self-serving, that he had chosen his loyalty to a political system over his loyalty to his family, and that this choice had been wrong. He wrote, "I believed I was being a good Soviet, and I was. But I was a terrible father because being a good father would have required me to put your welfare above everything else, and I did not do that. I put ideology above you. I put my sense of duty to a state above my duty to you. And I cannot undo that choice or take back the harm it caused." Eric and David exchanged letters periodically over the following years. They never achieved reconciliation in any complete sense. The damage was too profound, but they maintained contact, and Eric eventually visited his father in prison on several occasions. For Susan Brennan, or Svetlana Volkova, the experience was similar. She maintained hope for years that Rachel would contact her, but Rachel refused all communication until 1992, when Rachel was 22 years old and in college. Rachel sent her mother a brief letter indicating that she was willing to have limited contact, but was not prepared for a full relationship. They exchanged occasional letters, but never achieved closeness. The question of what would happen to David and Susan after they completed their prison sentences was complicated by geopolitics. Both had been Soviet citizens, but by the time they had served significant portions of their sentences, the Soviet Union had collapsed. It was unclear whether they retained citizenship or had any legal status in Russia. David was released from prison on parole in 2002 after serving 17 years. He was 62 years old. Susan was released in 2000 after serving 15 years. She was 58 years old. Both were subject to deportation proceedings. Eventually, through diplomatic negotiations, both were allowed to relocate to Russia, though they were not provided with support or recognition from Russian intelligence services. Rachel Brennan legally changed her name when she turned 18 in 1988. Her new name has been kept confidential to protect her privacy, and she has never spoken publicly about her experience. According to information provided by intermediaries to researchers, Rachel completed college, established a career, married, and had children of her own. She maintained minimal contact with both of her parents. She reportedly told friends that she thought of herself as having been orphaned in 1984 when her parents were arrested, and that the people in prison were strangers who happened to share her genetic material. Eric Brennan followed a different path. He struggled with substance abuse problems in his late teens and early 20s, issues he attributed to the trauma of his parents' arrest and the destruction of his family. With help from social services and therapists, he eventually achieved sobriety and stability. He worked in construction and later as a technical writer. He maintained more contact with his parents than Rachel did, visiting them in prison and corresponding with them after their release. In an interview he gave to a researcher studying the impact of parental incarceration in 2012, Eric stated that he had come to understand his parents as people who had made terrible choices but whom he could not stop loving despite the harm they had caused. Eric died in 2019 at the age of 46 from complications related to diabetes. According to his obituary, he was survived by a sister whose name was not listed. Neither of his parents attended the funeral. David had died in Russia in 2014 at the age of 74, and Susan, still living in Russia, was in poor health and unable to travel. Susan Volkova died in Russia in 2021 at the age of 79. According to her obituary in a Russian newspaper, she was survived by 2 children living in the United States, though neither was named. There is no indication that either Rachel or Eric attended her funeral or learned of her death immediately. The technical malfunction that Gordon Fletcher had recorded on March 17, 1984, 23 seconds of background sound from a transmission facility in Mexico, had been the first link in a chain of events that destroyed a family, exposed a Soviet intelligence operation, and contributed to the identification of several other illegal operations. David and Susan Volkov chose to become intelligence officers, chose to accept illegal assignments, chose to construct false identities, chose to have children and raise them within those false identities, and chose to conduct espionage operations for more than a decade. Those choices were theirs, and they bore responsibility for them. But they made those choices within a Cold War context that presented ideological conflict as existential struggle, that valorized intelligence work as patriotic service, that normalized deception as a necessary tool of statecraft. The children, Rachel and Eric, bore no responsibility. They were victims of their parents' choices, of Cold War ideological conflict, of intelligence operations conducted by states that treated human beings as instruments. They grew up believing they were American, believing their family history was real. When that entire edifice collapsed, they were left with trauma that marked them for life. David Volkov was 44 years old when he was arrested, 62 when he was released from prison, 74 when he died believing he had served his country but destroyed his family in the process. Susan Volkova was 42 when arrested, 58 when released, 79 when she died alone in Russia, far from her children. Rachel was 14 when her parents were arrested, and the trauma of that day shaped the rest of her life. Eric was 11 when his parents were arrested, and he spent the rest of his life trying to come to terms with that loss, dying at 46 without ever fully resolving it. The broken radio transmission lasted 23 seconds. The investigation it triggered lasted 9 months. The legal consequences were completed within 16 months. But the human consequences, the destroyed trust, the fractured identities, the lifetime struggle to understand, extended across decades and ultimately across generations as Rachel and Eric carried their trauma forward into their own adult lives. What remains is complexity. David and Susan Volkov were Soviet intelligence officers who became American suburbanites who were revealed as spies. Rachel and Eric Brennan were children who became victims, who became survivors, struggling to build lives from the wreckage. Gordon Fletcher was an amateur radio hobbyist whose observation contributed to a counterintelligence success that troubled him. Lauren Huang and Marcus Webb were intelligence professionals whose work identified and stopped espionage operations while contributing to the destruction of a family. The larger questions raised extend beyond individual choices to how states conduct intelligence operations and how those operations affect human beings. The Cold War created systems on both sides that normalized deception and the use of human beings as instruments of state policy. These systems produced useful intelligence and advanced national interests. They also produced human wreckage. Broken families, traumatized children, individuals whose identities had been fractured by the demands of intelligence work. The 23 seconds of broken radio transmission captured sounds from a room in Mexico where Soviet technicians were monitoring an encrypted broadcast. Those sounds revealed nothing of intelligence value. But the malfunction, documented by an amateur radio operator and analyzed by signals intelligence professionals, led to an investigation that unraveled a network of illegals and ended with 2 people in prison and 2 children traumatized. The Brennan case is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a successful counterintelligence operation. That assessment is accurate. But the complete account requires attention to the human beings involved, the choices they made and the choices made for them, the consequences they experienced, and the consequences imposed on others. David and Susan Volkov destroyed their family for a cause that dissolved before they were released from prison. Rachel and Eric lost their parents, their identities, and their childhoods for a Cold War conflict they had no part in creating and no power to stop. The technical malfunction that exposed them was random, the investigation that followed was methodical, and the consequences rippled outward in ways no one anticipated or fully controlled.